welcome back to Critical Conversations, episode number 19. It's good to have you with us. My name is Sam Castles. My co-host, as always, Jared Bessie.
Hello, everyone.
And welcome to the show. If this is your first time, Critical Conversations is a show where we sit down, talk about current events, maybe some philosophical, political ideas, and just have a good dialogue about them. And try to sit down and figure out what's behind all of the noise and the craziness. So, yeah. Welcome. Today we are talking about, in a nutshell, the future of the GOP, right? It's been a busy week in a few different ways, and we'll get into that and talking about where does the party go now that Trump is no longer in office and there's no head really of the GOP. There's no House majority leader. We only have minority leaders in the House and the Senate now.
Right, and I think there's a big division among, especially the House members, of what to think and what to do next. So I think it'll be worth discussing and talking about. So,
right. I think any party, after it loses an election in some form or loses a majority, has some thinking to do. But now that the Republicans have lost the executive and Senate control and still do not have House control, they are at sort of a larger crossroads than normal, let's say.
Yep.
But yeah. Before we jump into all of that, do we have a little bit of news to talk about?
Yeah, we got a couple pieces of news. This week, I just read an article that I thought was super fascinating, and it's about the flu. And basically, in the U.S., we have only had, I think it's like 1,500 cases of the flu, all year, which is, fewer than 1,500, which seems wild considering the thousands and thousands we normally have, hundreds of thousands, and I guess with a combination of the distancing and the masks and like all of the precautions we've done for COVID, that the flu hasn't had much chance to spread. I think a lot of it was also, I read, was because of schools, and since schools have so much more restrictions, because those are like hotbeds for the flu, and that's kind of where it spreads. So anyway, I just thought that was fascinating that this year we have like no flu cases.
Yeah. It really brings home that the flu and corona are like two different diseases.
Yes. No, it really does. They are not the same. But yeah, so I just thought that was a very fascinating piece of information.
Absolutely. It came and went because I know a lot of people were worried, like, oh, we're going to have a bad flu season while COVID is at its highest. And then, you're right. It kind of came and went without so much as a peep.
Yep. Which people are worried maybe even for next year, because usually they make the next flu shot based on the previous flu strain, but we didn't really have enough data of this year's flu strain. So it could be interesting next year.
Absolutely.
But anyway.
Some news that I have on the COVID vaccine, we have Johnson & Johnson this week applied basically for emergency approval from the FDA for its vaccine. And it is definitely a very different vaccine from the Pfizer, Moderna, or even I think AstraZeneca in Europe. Right. It is a one-shot vaccine, so you don't have to go back twice, once for they're 2 weeks apart. And obviously I think the biggest change that would be is just how quickly they're able to administer it. It's going to be literally twice as fast because you have to schedule just one shot instead of two.
Yep.
And it is able to be stored at a higher temperature, right, is also a big one.
Right, so this would be much easier for pharmacies and like these big distribution centers to be able to have lots of these.
Yeah. Right, so in the statement that Johnson & Johnson released, they claim that be able to supply 100 million doses in the first half of 2021 if they are granted approval. So that would be huge. It's not quite as effective as preventing the disease from getting. I think what I'm reading here on NPR says 66% effective overall in preventing moderate to severe COVID 4 weeks after the shot. But apparently, it is a lot better at keeping you from getting hospital severe.
Which, if we have, I feel like it could be a really good solution for once it gets to the general population. Once all of the elderly populations and vulnerable populations get the really safe and really effective Moderna or Pfizer, then the rest of us can get this one shot. And so it starts going faster and faster. And since hopefully we'll be by, closer to herd immunity at that point,
Right.
That would be really good.
So the FDA is going to spend the next couple of weeks reviewing this massive amount of data that Johnson & Johnson sent over, and then they're supposed to meet on February 26th to hopefully that won't take long to get the approval done. But it will at least be until February 26th when they start meeting after they've reviewed the data.
Yep.
Hopefully, hopefully that gets moved along. That'll be nice.
Hopefully pretty soon.
Any other news?
I think that was it. So we can jump right into our topic for this week.
Nice.
So, this has a lot of our kind of news in it. There was the news about Mike Lindell, who's the My Pillow guy. I don't know if people know about him, but he's just kind of this big right-wing guy that's been popular, and like all his stuff now has been banned from major stores because that's what people do nowadays. But he released this documentary on OAN, which is One America's News Network, and they put this like huge disclaimer before. It basically the documentary was showing how the whole election was corrupt and everything was wrong, and they put this huge disclaimer about it this was all opinion and this has nothing to do with our reporting. This is all about him. And so it was just funny, and everyone on the left was like, look, they don't even believe their own stuff. So anyway, but apparently the documentary is going to save America and unite us all, and we'll all be finally revealed the truth.
Right.
So,
and he's been banned from Twitter as well. I think that happened before this even came out. And
anyway.
Fascinating times.
Yep. All right. So we can jump into the topic now.
All right.
But basically, I kind of wanted to just have us sit down and talk about what the future of the GOP is, right? Because we have this big discussion among both party leaders and elites and even among the population is, where does the GOP go next in a party without Trump? Or are we just a holding pattern until Trump comes back in 2024? And so I think you see this huge division between the more Trumpian Republicans and the more classical conservative Republicans that don't know how to rectify, because there's all these new senators and a lot, especially in Congress, that have been elected in the last 4 years, about the midterms, and then again in November, that are very more Trumpian in style because that's what voters have been voting for. So you see kind of this split. And so I thought it was just worth digging into, and there's kind of been two stories in the news this week that I think exemplify the difference between these two groups and kind of what the future could hold for the party. So I'll kind of start with the Liz Cheney stuff, and you feel free to jump in wherever.
Yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, so basically, we had the impeachment happen in the House. So right after the January 6th riots, the House moved really, really quickly to impeach. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. And then the House, there were 10 Republicans in the House that voted for impeachment of Trump. And one of those included Liz Cheney, who was basically second in command for the GOP. So she's right under the House Minority Leader. And
Dick Cheney's daughter, right?
Yes, correct. And so she was kind of like the big one that people weren't expecting, because for the last 4 years she's pretty much sided with Trump. Like she's no she's no leftist. Like the left, like they do not like Liz Cheney. Like she's a pretty strong conservative Republican and has been sided with Trump on a lot of his stuff. And so it was very surprising to see her shift. But being the partisanship that we are, and the people that are like crazy Trump supporters, her like popularity plummeted after she voted for this, or she voted for impeachment. And basically there were calls in the House to have her removed from her leadership position. I forget the name of the guy who was kind of leading this, but one of the younger congressmen, he's been like shoring up votes, and he was like, yes, we have enough votes to remove her. So I think they just had to have a majority basically among the House, or among the Republicans in the House. But because it's a leadership position, it's a secret ballot. And so that was taken earlier this week just to see whether she would stay in power, and only 61 voted against her. So in reality, there were a lot more Republicans that ended up voting with Cheney,
Right.
probably because it was a secret ballot. I don't know if that had been an open floor vote, how different would it be? Because right now, among
Right.
among Republicans in general, not actual congressmen, she is not very popular. So I think that's really fascinating, because she's very classical, or more classical Republican, has been around for a little while.
Right. So this is kind of an interesting vote because it's almost like a mini referendum on Trump in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of like, can you vote with your conscience on something like this?
Right.
Because in general, I think even in Wyoming, where Cheney's from, like, her district probably would not wanted her to vote for impeachment of Trump. But she was like, hey, I truly believe this. I think he violated the Constitution. I think he needs to be removed from office. Like, this is how I'm voting with my conscience. So I think there was a lot of that at play too, kind of saying whether we have to listen to, these constituents. And so anyway, yeah, it was a really interesting vote. But yeah, so that was a big win for her. I think that happened on Wednesday of this week. But on the other side of the Republican Party is the newly elected Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene. If you haven't heard of her, she was just elected in Ohio, right? I'm pretty sure it's Ohio.
I don't remember. I think you're right.
Georgia. Sorry, yes, Georgia.
Georgia. Okay.
And so she, in the last couple of weeks, has come out, people have found a lot of old statements of her supporting QAnon conspiracy theories, which are far right, crazy conspiracies, talking about a child sex ring and the government and all this crazy stuff. And then there was like an old tweet she responded to that was like, it would be better if we just shot all of the Democrats in the head or something. And she liked the message, was like, yeah, sounds quick. And it was like just kind of some crazy loony stuff. And so there was a call for her to be removed from her committee meetings. And she came out and apparently to other congressmen and congresswomen, she was very apologetic and said, hey, I don't believe any of this stuff anymore. I represent my constituents, this is whatever. But publicly, she didn't say any of that. Publicly, she was like, yeah, I don't believe that anymore, but didn't apologize, didn't really say, just kind of brushed it past and moved on, because her constituents support what she, some of these crazy things. And so she knows politically that, she's a huge Trump fan and all of this stuff.
Right.
But minority leaders basically said, hey, I'm not going to remove her from committees. That's not really up to me. And so that goes to a full House vote, including Democrats included, because everyone votes to put people on committees. And they voted her out of committees on Thursday. So that was kind of the big news. So it was kind of a win so this week was kind of a win for the more less Trumpian.
Sure. Kind of your more establishment wing Republicans, yes. Right? Yes. Not really the outsiders.
Right. Exactly. So I just think, yeah, it's just a really interesting thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that I think is becoming obvious for a lot of these Republicans who want to continue being elected, maybe some that have hopeful presidential bids one day, or more ambitious bids in other forms, is that they publicly are never going to disavow Trump or go too extreme, but privately they would like to move on and sort of get back to the way things were probably pre-Trump. And I mean, we can talk about this in general. I don't know if you want to continue talking about Greene and Cheney more in depth, but it's just this sort of idea that I see a lot of people talking about Trump as if he was his own brand, and that he invented his own brand of conservatism and republicanism, and everyone likes to term things Trumpian or whatever. Right. But I think it's important to remember that while he probably did swing a lot of people over to his way of thinking, he definitely tapped into a strain of thought that was already there. Like, he didn't invent America first. He didn't invent like tough on immigration, and these are always ideas that have been out there, but he sort of came in as a notable outsider that people started to rally around, and thought like, okay, this guy isn't like the Washington
Right.
that we have come to hate. I mean, honestly, like, Congress approval ratings as a whole are
Visible. Yeah.
20%, sometimes lower than 20%,
Yep.
and disapproval ratings like equally high, 80%
Yep.
sometimes. And yeah, I think that was an energy that he tapped into and did not invent. So
No, I think that's for sure. It's not like he just came in and was like created all these new policies that people were
right,
like, oh, I never thought about that. Let's do that. It was things that had been simmering beneath the surface that hadn't really been, tapped into before, that he
right,
really came around. I think that's, true with a lot of populist figures. Like, you kind of find what
right.
the people are kind
Yeah,
of simmering for in general.
right. Yeah, and I think in 2016 they thought, okay, well, this sort of rhetoric, this will only get you so far. Like, you're going up against kind of the man in terms of Republican longtime senators, and
Right.
these people have been in the game and playing the game for forever. And they thought like, okay, maybe he's beating one or two, but he's not going to beat Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. But then when it happened, they were like, okay, this is weird. And then he went on to win the presidency, and we saw some red waves, and we got the Senate.
Yep.
And it's like, I think the Republicans leadership has to sit down and think about like, okay, well, we're not a huge fan of this, but we are winning, right? And
But yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry, continue.
until recently, right?
Right, because like then this is the first president in like the last 6 that has lost one term and lost a house and lost all 3 branches of government. When he came into office,
Right.
it was all red, and now it's all like in 4 years, it's completely flipped.
Right.
So
yeah, so
the first president to do that in a long time.
Yeah, and it is interesting, and this is kind of probably useless to discuss, but what would have happened? Would he have won again without COVID? Right. So I mean, Trump's number one running point had always been the economy, and obviously this COVID, there was no way to save the economy. I mean, it was going to happen one way or the other, government intervention or not. It was going to take a hit of sizable proportions, and
Yep.
as close as it was with the economy as bad as it was, and
I had said for years, like, if people asked me if Trump was going to get reelected, I was like, people vote with their wallets. So if nothing big happens in 2020, I think he'll get reelected. And then, well, something big happened in 2020. So
yes, true. Yeah. So that is interesting. So, but it all sort of ties into like, I think the same sort of question, like what do we do? We were able to win in 2016. And then in 2020, we had this massive COVID thing and ended up losing pretty substantially, but not that substantially. Like the House was still a big win. It was still a close election. Like, elections are starting to be a lot closer in terms of popular vote and electoral college as well. So historically, I mean, it's still a big gap in popular vote, but historically we've seen much bigger gaps. So
yes, true. Yeah, I think it's just interesting, and I think there's just a blend of how much of like not even Trumpian policies that we do, like your Marjorie Taylor Greenes, but more just like Trump himself, like Kevin McCarthy, who's this minority leader in the House. Basically, the one thing he's done in the last 2 weeks is go visit Trump for 3 days in Florida. Like,
yeah.
And he's kind of like passed off all these kind of other responsibilities. Like, he wouldn't remove Green, and he was like, oh, we'll let the whole House do that, and like a couple other things. So it's like, so is Trump still commanding a lot of this? And I think we see that less in the Senate because Mitch McConnell's been around for so long, and I think McConnell's very establishment. He wants things to return to status quo.
Right.
But yeah, so it's just really interesting to see how much of a role is Trump himself going to play.
Yeah.
Going forward, although he doesn't have much of a platform among like the populations anymore.
Right.
So without Twitter.
Right. Yeah, we're going to see the effects of that for sure.
But yeah, it's just really interesting. I think yeah, there's just this internal division and deciding what happens next. And this, I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago. How much do senators and congressmen like follow their constituents who right now are still super strong for Trump? I want to talk a little bit about this Ipsos study that was released in the last couple of days, which I think is super fascinating. But basically, this survey was done asking about all sorts of different like questions and whether you agree with them or not. And it was questions like, how much do you trust the following people, like Trump, Biden, like pretty typical public polls. But then they did a study on just like whether or not something is true or false. And so some questions like, there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud or election fraud that affected the outcome of the election. And of course, 84 Democrats say it's true, but only 24 Republicans say that's true. So 55% of Republicans still think that there was still election fraud that affected the outcome of the election. And that was in the 14th of January. So like
very recent.
Questions about people who broke into the U.S. Capitol were undercover members of Antifa. 34% of Republicans still believe that's true.
And what is the not sure on that as well?
Not sure is 42%. So only 23 say that's false.
Right.
So it's a very high don't know, that because they don't really know how to. Yeah. Or like electronic voting machines change votes for Trump into votes for Biden in the election. 45% think that's true, compared to only 7% of Democrats think that's true. Right. So there's several others that are just really interesting. Joe Biden legitimately won the election. Only 27% of Republicans say that's true. Anyway, it's just fascinating. And it's worth noting that like these polls will always have some sort of bias about how people want to answer. Right. So you can't take them completely at face value. If you like Trump and you're listening to what Trump is saying, then you just kind of like, oh yeah, that's what he's saying, so that's what I'm going to agree with. And there's a lot of like following of the elites in that. But it just goes to show like how much power those people have over the general perception.
Absolutely.
So I know we've talked a lot of this stuff to death, but I think it shows kind of these senators and congressmen are stuck in between like, well, 57% of my constituency base, thinks this.
Right.
And the other half don't even know. The other half of the 40% don't even know, like, what do I do with that? And how does that inform my vote?
Right. So do you think it's kind of the job of representative or senator to echo their voter base, or do you think their only job is to say, well, okay, you voted me in, but now I'm at the wheel, and if you like the decisions I make, you can vote me in again, and if you don't like what I make, you can vote me out, but I'm going to vote my conscience, and I'm not going to sit here spinning my wheels about what you think about every decision.
Man, that's such a tough question. Like, I mean, I think it depends on the issue. A lot of times I think, I'm always happy if if a congressman like doesn't vote what the general constituency thinks, but what I think, it's like, oh, that's fine. So
right,
I definitely, there's bias there for sure. But I just think, it's so hard. I think you should stick to what you ran for and what a lot of the things you said you were going to do, or at least try to do them.
Yeah.
Because that's why you got elected. But at the same time, studying political history and like the process of government, it's about compromise and it's about finding these balances. So you're never going to be able to truly make your constituency perfectly happy. Unless you control like all branches of government. But even then, it's like there's still reasons to compromise, even if you don't have to compromise. So I definitely understand that gets really tricky, because you're put in a situation that you can't do exactly what your constituency wants because you have to find a balance.
Right.
which I think we're seeing less and less of, because constituencies can gather together so much easier with social media and with the internet. It's so much easier to rally or get mad at somebody and be affected on Twitter or whatever it is than it was before. And also, it's all just so much more public. Like a lot of times you would hear this person speak to you and you're like, oh, this person sounds really cool. I like what they're going to do. You vote them in and then you don't really hear much from them. They'll come back and give like a town hall and you're like, okay, you're doing great. Here's what I've done. Here's what I've tried to do for you. And then they go back to Washington and work on their compromises and get the things done. But it's so much more public now. We can watch every session of Congress. There are Twitter accounts that you follow to know exactly who voted for what. And we have access to that information so much easier, which I think affects all of that. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not perfect. Like, I don't think they can sit down and be like, what does my constituency believe on every single issue, right? Like
right. Yeah, you drive you nuts. And your constituency may not agree about a lot of things.
Right.
If something has 40% versus 60%, but you agree with the 40%, like, is that okay?
Right.
In that situation, what if it's 20-80?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah. And at the end of the day, there's the reason we don't have like a direct democracy on everything. Like,
right.
The founders, if you look at their writings on, Federalist Papers, Anti-Federalist Papers, it's pretty obvious that democracy, honestly, as far back as democracy was invented, like with the Greeks, and they viewed pure democracy as mob rule, and we kind of elect these officials to sort of be a check and be able to slow things down a little bit, which is less and less popular these days. Like a lot of, especially the progressive wings of the party would prefer things be a pure democracy, and things like the Electoral College they view as very anti-democratic. And but yeah, it's definitely, I think, interesting. I think I tend to side with you. Like, it's probably good for them to stick to what they promised in their campaign. I think that anything else is just straight up lying to your constituents and really not in the spirit of why we have elections to begin with. But once you're in office, like when things come up, I would prefer politicians just vote their conscience, because if they're doing things they don't believe in, I don't think these things tend to be thought out very well,
and I think
are really done with the same intent, right?
Right, and I think we're seeing that in the GOP of the opposite of like what happens when they truly side not against their conscience, but like start siding with just whatever their constituency says, and that's led to a lot of this internal division in the GOP.
Right, and it's something I think people don't like about politicians is they will say or do whatever it takes to get elected or stay in power, and you're like, okay, well, you ran on cutting this and cutting that and saying you were, or the opposite, you were going to provide this, provide that. You got there, you didn't do it, because you were worried about making these constituents mad or these donors mad, and so it's a tough balance,
Yeah. Where do you think we'll see in a year from now? What do you think the GOP is going to look like leading into the next election?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think it's going to depend a lot on what sort of battles happen politically. Like, we're going to see probably some key votes in the coming months and years, but I think it might be sort of in limbo until we have a presidential campaign and candidates start stepping forward for 2024. It's hard to know. I mean, in 2016, we had a GOP platform that was they meet during the convention and they come up with an official platform, and it's written like resolved, whereas, like very formal looking. And in 2016, it was like 60 some plus pages of beliefs and tenets and what the party stands for, which generally like are not that, I don't know.
They're not
deep.
Binding, but
like
they're not that like.
They're very, but they're like a campaign commercial. They're like, we're gonna fight for justice and we're gonna bring back jobs, and like they aren't concrete plans, but they still try to let the people know, okay, this is what our party still believes in. This is what we want to do going forward. Anyway, and in 2020, it was basically one page long, and it said that where the Republican GOP party is going to basically continue to back President Trump's America's First agenda. And that was like the extent of it, which, I mean, there's probably a lot of factors and thought that went into just not really coming up with the new 2020 platform and sort of just backing Trump. Because again, like we talked about, that won big in 2016, but obviously 2020 was a different scenario. But it sort of brings us back to, okay, well, it's been over 5 years now since we've properly come up with a platform. And
yeah, I think that leads to a division when you have backed a man instead of a person, or instead of a platform.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, when that person is removed, and you see this happen with churches, right? Like when pastors are gone, the whole church just doesn't know what's next, and it just kind of collapses.
Right. Yeah. So it's gonna be interesting. I think the party has to figure out, and you know, the Democrat Party struggles with these same things. Like they have a progressive wing, they have an establishment wing, and then the Republicans sort of have their establishment wing, and then kind of these outsider, more skeptical of government in general, branch of Republican voters. But they're gonna have to figure out a way to still tap into that anti-establishment, like drain the swamp, very Trumpian type energy without alienating the more traditional Republican,
which I think is what we're seeing
branch.
Much more from like the McConnells. They're very much kind of hovering in this balance. Like if he like truly came out super strong against Trump and alienated all of these people, the GOP really would fall apart, because there would be, you know, we'd have two smaller parties. I am curious to see, like, over the next 5-10 years, like, would we see a party split and kind of new coalitions of new parties? Because it's not happened before. Like, this kind of thing has happened in American politics.
Parties change, right? Yeah.
So I am curious to see if, you know, if this Trumpian wing like keeps rising and then kind of splits from, you know, there's rumors about maybe Trump will run third party next time or create his own party and run under a different, like, whole different platform. And so who knows?
Yeah, I agree, but I do think, you know, the parties have gotten so big, and politics is such a money game, and things have gotten entrenched the more government grows. So
right,
we will see.
Yeah, I think that's a not likely scenario, but I still think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, it is.
So
no doubt. I'll be curious. I think this is a big turning point for a lot of we already have a few hopefuls sort of in 2024, like senators that are thinking about running, and this will be an important 2 years before the next round of elections for House and Senate. But let's see, like Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, there could be like Ben Sass, you know, stuff like that. Be curious. People have always even talked about even crazier stuff like Tucker Carlson running, and
that would be wild. And
Trump could definitely run again. Pence could run.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's going to be a lot of the same general names. So I don't think too much will really change, but.
Right. It's just interesting. It's just worth keeping to following these internal kind of divisions and these votes like we had this week, and just seeing what's happening. And it's also going to depend a lot on what Democrats decide to do.
Right.
Like for the new COVID bill that's going to happen, I was reading some articles this week that were talking about how much should Democrats like choose to compromise, because they don't have to compromise. If they don't want to compromise, they can pass under budget reconciliation laws and pass with a 50% majority. But, you know, Biden's talked about unity and compromise. So it's like, okay, how much are they actually going to follow through on this? So it's going to be worth seeing. And if they do compromise more, I think these internal divisions in the GOP will matter more. But if they don't, then it's like, well, you can argue all you want, but you're not really doing much. So
right. Yeah. And I think it's a definitely interesting one, because I think the progressive wing would rather be more aggressive with minimum wage, be more aggressive with COVID relief, and then just say, look at we're helping you, and all the Republicans are voting against it. But like you're right, that the more establishment wants to try to work with Republicans. So that's an interesting divide. And I think that was a big ticket for the Democrats in their campaign was we're not going to focus too much on like the different wings of our parties, but we're going to just try to unify to beat the Republicans, beat Trump.
Right.
That was really the central tenet of Democrat policies and thinking in the campaign. And we might see a similar thing from Republicans going forward is like whatever gets us, like we can just all unify behind beating Democrats might be the message from the Republicans. So
couldn't be that surprised.
that tends to be how it goes.
So. Especially in this partisan world. So
Yep. All right. What else?
All right.
Any closing thoughts?
I think that's it. Ball's kind of in the Democrats' court legislatively right now.
Right.
So hopefully there can be some compromise in this COVID bill and something worked out. And hopefully we can have some level of unity. But I wouldn't be that surprised if it was just forced through as is, and that's what we get. So I'm not overly optimistic.
All right. Do you have a recommendation for us this week?
I do. So a lot of you have probably seen it or at least heard about it. The first MCU official show that's being produced by Marvel Studios is WandaVision. So this is it's really interesting because I think it needs some prelude to it. The first 3 episodes are pretty much just spoofs of classic sitcom eras. So the first one's in the 50s, and it like spoofs like the Dick Van Dyke Show and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, like those kind of shows. Second one is set in the 60s, and it's spoofing like Bewitched and those kinds of shows. And then the 70s, and so it's just there's kind of a mysterious element happening, but mostly it's just like these kind of fun, goofy spoofs. And then episode 4 is kind of like unveils kind of more of what's going on. And then episode 5 has been really, really great this week. So that's been airing weekly, and we'll get in a new episode every Friday through 9 episodes. So there's four more weeks to go. So it's definitely worth jumping on board soon if you haven't already, because it's very fun, both as a sitcom parody show if you grew up watching classic sitcoms, like some of which I like, those classic ones I did. So it's fun to see those kind of spoofed. And then also just if you're interested in the MCU, because I think it's got some big happenings going on. So,
nice. Awesome.
That's my recommendation. WandaVision.
Very cool. Thank you very much. We'll have to check it out.
For sure.
You want to give us the outro?
Yes. So thank you for joining us. This has been Critical Conversations. We just love being able to do this, and thank you for listening. Really means a lot. You can find us on Facebook, Critical Conversations, like that page to stay up to date on all episodes. We are on Spotify if you watch us, and Apple Podcasts, and all the places you can find podcasts if you watch us on YouTube, or you can find us on YouTube if you listen to the version on a podcast app. We'd love to have you join us in either spot. So next week, I don't know. We'll see what happens in the news.
Yes.
So maybe, hopefully, have a guest coming up pretty soon. So we'll keep you updated about that. But thank you for joining us.
All right. Thanks so much.
Have a great week.